Well, welcome back, everybody. Welcome to PXP. Today's podcast is about being consistent in your role as a leader. Look, nobody wants to work for somebody who's unpredictable from day to day, right? Well, let's talk about that today. You ready to get started? Here we go. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome back to PXP. I'm super glad that you joined us. Now be sure that you've subscribed so you don't miss a single episode, and be sure to invite your circle. Now I'm not sure where you live, but here in Alabama, the weather outside is starting to warm up, and I'm going to tell you that makes my soul happy. As you probably know, my office and my studio are in my home, and I walked out to the back patio earlier today, and the sun was beaming, and it was just so nice. My golden doodle, Ollie Bear, was out running around the backyard, and it was like a little slice of heaven, at least compared to the deep freeze that we've been experiencing over the past few weeks. I grew up in Wisconsin, and I'm hearing all the time, well, you must be used to the cold, Jamie. Well, the thing is, I've been in Alabama since 1994, and so I'm pretty much a Southerner now, and I'm definitely not used to the cold weather anymore. And not only that, but it's a different kind of cold. I remember when I was growing up and the temps would be just touching freezing, maybe in the 30s, and if the sun was out, you could go outside in a short-sleeved shirt and you wouldn't freeze. But in Alabama, when the weather gets down into the 30s, I just freeze for some reason. I don't know if it's the humidity or what it is, but the coldest that I've ever been has been right here in Alabama. Okay, so enough about the weather. Let's get on to the topic for today. We're talking about consistency, and in particular, being a leader that is consistent in how they treat their teams, how they handle problems, how they praise team members, how they communicate, and how they follow through on their commitments. These are all things that are super important as a leader that you are consistent about. I think we can all probably relate to a boss or a supervisor that we've had at some point in our career that failed to maintain some sense of consistency. And perhaps that leader was us at one point or even now. Maybe we weren't always the most consistent leader. And the challenge in having a leader that's inconsistent is it's hard for that leader to build trust and to build loyalty and to build dedication. Their team, they just never truly buy into them as a leader because the leader is routinely unpredictable. Does that make sense? And in today's podcast, I want to cover 4 areas where I see inconsistency having the greatest negative effects on the success of the leader. And then I want to talk about some ways for that leader to be consistent in those areas. Now, I remember as a growing young leader, I remember one of the hardest things to do was to treat all of my direct reports the same. And by that, I mean, I never needed to show any sort of favoritism. And that didn't mean that I didn't have favorites, right? Of course we're going to have favorites sometimes. As a leader, you're going to have your favorite employees. You're going to have the ones that maybe work a little harder or they're more bought into the team or they give you less heartache or perhaps you just connect with them better. You're going to have some employees that you just naturally gravitate to. But as a leader, those employees cannot get preferential treatment. Let me summarize that again. There are going to be employees who you just connect with, who you gravitate, who you have a closer relationship with. But those employees cannot get preferential treatment. You've got to treat all of your employees the same. So let's talk about some of those inconsistent behaviors. And the first one that I want to talk about is when a leader talks about one employee to another employee. Have you experienced that before? This is a really big deal, folks, and one of the quickest ways that you can ruin the morale of your team. I mean, the very essence of trust is broken when you share information about one employee with another employee that does not have a need to know, right? Certainly, there's going to be times when information needs to be shared because it's essential for the mission of the company and things like that, but that's not what I'm talking about. Let me give you an example. So a manager is having a disagreement with a direct report over a task or a project. And rather than that leader going to the employee, they go to one of the employee's coworkers and they talk about the issue with them. And oftentimes that coworker is probably somebody who the manager gets along well with, or They even may have some sort of a relationship or friendship outside of work. And while this is a hypothetical situation I'm making up, I have seen it happen countless times, and I'm sure that you probably have too. The problem is that supervisor has just broken the trust of the employee. And then in addition to that, they set a bad example for the employee that they actually went and talked to. If that favorite employee of theirs or that friend of theirs ever gets into a leadership role, they may think it's okay for them to do the very same thing. And the solution, it's simple. Don't talk about employees to other employees unless there's a need to know. Like literally, it's just that simple. If someone who doesn't have a need to know solicits information from you, simply tell them that you're not at liberty to discuss another employee. And explain that if the roles were reversed, you certainly wouldn't want that person to be talked about behind their back either, right? So keep confidential information confidential. It's that simple. And the second area where I often see a breakdown in consistency is in the area of accountability. When an employee needs to be held accountable for their actions, whether they failed to perform something or they did something that might have gone against company policy, and there needs to be some sort of an accountability plan. There needs to be some sort of, whether that is discipline or some sort of an action that needs to be taken. That action needs to be consistent across the board. Whether it's an employee that you really get along with or one that you can't stand, if the situation comes up where some form of remedial action needs to be taken, you better make sure that you're treating all the employees the same. Remember the old saying, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right? The ability to hold employees accountable for their actions in a professional manner without allowing emotion to interfere is an extremely valuable skill for a leader. Now, don't get me wrong. Sometimes this can be hard. It can be tough. But consistently handling these types of issues in a consistent manner, it's going to be huge in garnering the respect and the loyalty of your team. I'm sure you've heard this old saying, the fastest way to ruin a good employee is to tolerate a bad one. Well, don't let your friendship or your relationship or whatever connection you have with an employee, don't let that allow your actions to be inconsistent in how you would treat another employee under the same circumstances. Okay, now for the next area, let's talk about consistency in how we praise employees. So there's no doubt that people respond to praise differently, right? And even further, they have a varying preference in how they like to be praised. Some people like praise in public. Some people don't like praise in public, like they would just rather get a pat on the back, or some praise in private. Some people prefer a handwritten note or an email, and some would rather get additional responsibility, and some people want no recognition at all. You know, it's up to you as a leader to learn and to understand how each of your direct reports likes to receive praise, and to go along with that, it's equally as important that praise be given when it's earned. You know, don't allow your mood or your friendship or whatever else might be going on that day to change whether you deliver praise or not. And if your team does a good job, give them praise and let them get the recognition for the team's good job done. You don't need to be the one that hogs all the accolades, right? If your team does well, that's just a reflection of you. You don't have to make sure that everyone knows that you're the leader of the team. If your team likes and respects you, they're going to make sure that you're recognized for your leadership. And lastly today, let's talk about your commitments. You know, I was recently chatting with a young man who was promised a raise by one of the owners of the company. Now, he's a loyal, hardworking, dedicated, smart employee, and he just received an industry certification that makes him a very desirable employee to have on staff. The owner told him that his increase would be on his next check. Well, 1 week passed, the next check came out, no raise. So I coached the young man to let it ride for another pay period and just see what happened. Could have been an oversight. And the next paycheck comes out, still no increase. This time I coached him to inquire with the manager about the increase and see if there was an issue. Like, let's find out, is there a problem? So the boss told him, I'll have it on your next check. The next check comes out. You guessed it, no increase. You see where this is going, right? At some point, this young man is going to be faced with, a decision that he's got to make, right? He can do one of three things. He can continue to work without the pay increase, or he can continue to ask his boss about the pay increase and hope that it eventually shows up at some point, or he can move on to a company that values and respects him in his role as a good employee. Now, everybody's circumstances are different, and the timetable on what decision you make when, that's going to just be different for everybody. But the bottom line is that this employee should not even be in the position where they have to chase down their supervisor to make sure that the supervisor makes good on his commitment. The boss should be consistent in what he said he would do. Too often, I think, as leaders, we fail to understand the impact that we have on the lives of our employees. The boss that I just talked about, they may not consider a couple bucks an hour to be a big deal. Maybe to them they're not. But to this young man, it is a big deal. It's a big deal for financially. It's a big deal for recognition. It's a big deal for the trust that he has between him and his boss. It's a big deal for that boss to keep the commitment. When we make commitments and we fail to keep them, we break the trust between us and our employees. And trust is one of those things, and you've heard this before, it's easy to lose, but it's hard to gain back. Be a leader that follows through on their commitments. If you can't do what you say, then don't say it to begin with. And if you say it, then do it. Break your neck to do it. Go above and beyond to do it. Do it at your expense, but keep your commitment. And if there's no way possible to keep your commitment, then go to that employee, explain the situation, tell them how you spoke out of turn, and that you're going to do everything that you can to make it right in the future. When the opportunity allows, you'll make it right in the future. Be a leader that can be relied upon to keep their word. So my challenge to you today is this. Be a leader that's consistent. Consistent in treating the employees the same, consistent in delivering accountability, consistent in praise, and consistent in keeping your commitments. And in doing so, you're going to be a well-respected leader with loyal and dedicated employees who are willing to walk through fire or willing to go the extra mile to ensure that your team is successful. Well, that's all the time I've got for today. Thanks so much for listening to PXP. As always, if you enjoyed the podcast, please share it with your circle. Chances are that they're going to like it too. But most of all, I hope that something was said today that helps you to become a better version of yourself. I'm your host, Jamie Yarrow, and I hope you have an absolutely amazing day.